Welcome to Hooked, Fishing for Ted Hughes in and beyond the archive with special guest Mark Wormald. Today's event was recorded at the McGill downtown campus, which is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nations. We honor, recognize, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands, and, perhaps more importantly to today's topic, the waters on which McGill University stands today. We're surrounded by water here on the island of Montreal, and today we're taking a moment out of the current to think about the fish that inhabit those waters and the practice and marriage between poetry and fishing in the work of Ted Hughes. So I will pass the microphone to Chris Lyons, who's going to give us some collection comments, and then introduce today's special guest, Mark Wormald.
Terrific, thanks. Good. Hi, it's really nice to have you here. My name is Chris Lyons. I'm Associate Dean Interim for ROAAr, which is Rare Books, Osler Library of the History of Medicine, McGill University Archives, and the Visual Arts Collection. So collectively, we represent the special collections held by the library. And I wanted to tell you a bit about some of our collections. The reason being is that part of the idea of the talks is to promote our collection. So we cast a wide net and we trawl for interesting users and new readers to use our collection. So what we're doing with this is it's like eye candy to hook you in to using our this. I've only just begun. This is good. This is going to be the longest 5 minutes of your life. All right. So what I was interested in thinking about this is what can I talk to people that's relevant to ours? Well, one of fairly obvious parts of our collection is related, of course, to poetry. So does anyone recognize this? You might have a copy falling apart on your shelves from when you were an undergraduate. So one of the libraries is a very good collection of Canadian poetry put together by Ralph Gustafson, who started collecting Canadian poetry very seriously to put together this anthology, which interestingly enough came out during the Second World War. So I find that fascinating. And that's what he looks like. If you've ever seen him, he's on the inside cover. So we've got mostly it's 20th century Canadian, some 19th century material as well. So that's one of the libraries we have. One of the other one is Louis Dudek, who you may or may not have heard of. It's a luminary, certainly at McGill and across the country, in terms of not only his actual writings, but his teaching as well. And one of his students, perhaps his most famous student, was a gawky undergraduate by the name of Leonard Cohen, who he encouraged. The apocryphal story being is that they were in the arts building and they were talking, and Louis Dudek had a rolled up whatever paper was in his hand, and he told Leonard Cohen to kneel down, and when he did, he tapped him on the shoulder and said, "I dub thee poet." So inspirational man. His library is not only interesting, it's vast. There's about 6,000 items. Many of them are annotated. So this is a copy of his oldest copy. He had several copies of Cantos, which have a lot of his annotations over years, different pens, so you can see the evolution of his thought in addition to his initial reading. This is a fascinating collection. I really love this because this, to me, speaks of what the passion of people. Joe Fishstein, Bronx garment worker, not particularly well educated or anything, but with a great love of Yiddish literature, particularly poetry, but not only poetry. So collected books as they were in print in the 20th century, collected some out of print material as well. But he did something beyond that. He decorated his books. So he would sew and make boxes, usually remnants of material he was working with at the shop and everything like that. So I like to think that when he was through spending his days sewing jackets, he went home to sew jackets. Pause for laughter. Thank you. All right. And we also have archives of various poets, some of whom you might know personally, Michael. And a number of them belong to this group of avant-garde Montreal poets from the 1960s. And there are other 70s, 60s, 70s, 60s. I look at you. Did they go back to the 60s? The vehicle poets?
They go back to the prehistoric, I think.
Okay. So the 6,000 BC. Okay, great. So we have a number of their collections. Also, other poets like Stephen Huyton, who just passed away rather young. It was quite sad to see. Wonderful man, and a few other collections as well. But in addition to poetry, we have fishing books and we have travel books based on it. It's a wonderful genre. I realize it's quite a big genre. A number of these came from a man named Dr. Louis Rieford, who was a neurosurgeon, most famous for amputating Georges Vanier's leg during the First World War. So I don't know if that and fishing are somehow related, but we do have a good collection of this material. That was a picture. And I find it fascinating because you can do a lot with this sort of stuff. You can see the evolution of fishing, particularly in Canada. So this is one. So A Tale of Lake Saint Jean, so Lac Saint Jean, and a plentitude of fish stories, which I'm sure we're going to hear more of today. And you can even look at a bit of gender issues as well in representation. I particularly enjoyed this one. This was the Quebec government getting into the travel business in promoting fishing. And you have the French one. Actually, it's got a nice sort of vellum binding to it, the cover, which is quite nice. English people, the English version is not quite so fancy. And so you could see the Fisherman's Paradise. That's the English one. And I like this illustration in particular, because at first I thought the guy was giving a smoke to the fish. And it made me think of like when someone's about to be executed, you know, that thing. So I said, you know, before you fry, here's your cigarette. But apparently the fry joke, no, fish, fry, no, electric chair. Jeez, what a hard ass punch. Anyway, so I just like that. The English one doesn't have the smoking fisherman in it. So I don't know what that said, but anyway, fun stuff. And a lot of just interesting thing. Again, the evolution of fishing in Canada and fishing in tourism, and the railways get involved in a lot of promotion of fishing as well. So that's it. And then there's just a genre of that. That's a beautiful late 19th century decorative binding, publisher's binding for that, for fish and fish. So you can see just the feel for it. And this one was a curious one, which is the autobiography of a salmon. And it's written from the perspective of a salmon. And so I thought this was a curious, funny way to talk about the life cycle of a salmon. And I don't have any joke for that. So I'm going to go on to introduce our speaker. I'm hooked. Okay, so Mark Wormald has been fishing since the age of 4. So he's an award-winning poet, winning the Newdigate Prize at Oxford in 1988 and the E.C. Gregory Award from the Society of Authors in 1995. Mark has been a fellow in English at Pembroke College, Cambridge, since 1992. His first office, and this was interesting, was once the bed-sitting room in which Ted Hughes dreamed of a burned fox. I don't know if he was hungry, but sounds good. He edited Charles Dickens's The Pickwick Papers for Penguin Classics, and more recently co-edited 2 collections of essays, Ted Hughes, From Cambridge to Collected in 2013, and Ted Hughes, Nature and Culture in 2018. He lives in Cambridge and is available for interviews, essays, radios, and events, and will speak to you right now. Thank you.
I don't think I can follow that, honestly. So, thank you so much, everyone. It's great to be here. As will become clear, there is only one place in the world that I would rather be today.
Fishing?
Wait and see. I'm going to be talking about the origins and method, it sounds a bit dry, of a book that I've just written called The Catch, Fishing for Ted Hughes. But I wanted to begin by reading a poem from this collection, River, which is absolutely at the heart of my book, without which I would never have written the book and my life would not have changed as it has through the experience of writing and researching and fishing it over the last 10 years. It's called Go Fishing. And in its earliest draft, which Pembroke College, Cambridge, my college, and Ted Hughes's college has in its archives, it is made up of a series of infinitives. By the time it had hit the page of the poem, they become imperatives. And Ted Hughes believed passionately in the importance of going fishing. So take this literally and follow in his footsteps, as I have been doing. Go fishing. Join water. Wade in underbeing. Let brain mist into moist earth. Ghost loosen away downstream. Gulp river and gravity. Lose words. Cease. Be assumed into glistenings of lymph, as if creation were a wound, as if this flow were all plasm healing. Be supplanted by mud and leaves and pebbles, by sudden rainbow monster structures that materialize in suspension gulping and dematerialize under pressure of the eye. Be cleft by the sliding prow, displaced by the hull of light and shadow, dissolved in earth wave, the soft sun shock, dismembered in sun melt, become translucent. One untangling drift of water mesh and a weight of earth taste light, mangled by wing shadows. Everything circling and flowing and hover still, crawl out over roots, new and nameless. Search for face, harden into limbs. Let the world come back, like a white hospital busy with urgency words. Try to speak and nearly succeed. Heal into time and other people. That is a poem about the imperative of fishing and the transformations that await you when you fish. When you experience the flow of water, when you expose yourself in a kind of shamanistic way to dismemberment, wounding, but allow yourself to heal. When you lose words and then let them come back. As an experience, that has not much to do with the reputation of Ted Hughes, certainly in North America, and generally, I think, in the English-speaking world. Two covers. One, Diane Middlebrook's book, Her Husband. Jonathan Bate's book, Ted Hughes, The Unauthorized Life. Jonathan Bate came and gave a talk at Pembroke College in 2010, which was the year that the British Library opened its extensive archive of Ted Hughes material, and so proved that the huge archive at Emory University, which Ted Hughes had sifted and sold to them in 1995, was nothing like the whole collection of his papers. Jonathan Bate was at work on his biography of Ted Hughes, and he made a comment at a conference which I had co-organized, simply because, being a fellow of Pembroke, I knew where the loos were, honestly. And he said this, he said, there is too much now available in the archive for Ted Hughes scholars, but fortunately, only some of it will be of relevance to the literary biographer, particularly the literary biographer who believes, as Jonathan Bate does, that the death of Sylvia Plath was the central fact in Ted Hughes's life and work. And he illustrated this. Amongst the material that would be irrelevant was the fact that Ted Hughes had some fishing diaries. Now, you've already heard from Chris. I started fishing at the age of 4. I love to fish. My ears pricked up. I thought there may be an essay in this. I was doing a big admin job for a while, but I represented the college. And as a representative of the college, I was invited to go to the ceremony at which Ted Hughes, who had been Poet Laureate from 1984 to his death in 1998, and given the Order of Merit just before his death, that which the memorial stone was dedicated in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And it is inscribed with the end of the poem That Morning, which describes his fishing for salmon with bears in Alaska in the summer of 1980. So we found the end of our journey. So we stood alive in the river of light, among the creatures of light, salmon and bears, creatures of light. They had become transfigured. That gratified me for reasons that I'll show you. Something else about that service intrigued me. This is, in this poem, that morning ends the collection River, which I have been working on. Something else, though, interested me. The gratification was that 10 years before, I had chosen that morning to appear in stained glass windows we have devoted to Ted Hughes at Pembroke. So I was pleased to see that, my choice matched that of the estate and his publishers. But I was also surprised by two things. Seamus Heaney, dear friend of Ted Hughes, read a poem that at that point I hadn't come across before called Some Pike for Nicholas, which Ted published in a fishing magazine. We'll see more of this in 1997. And Carol Hughes, Ted's widow, in a radio broadcast to accompany the ceremony, talked about the way that when Ted fished, he literally lost words, lose words from that poem. He lost the power of forming speech for several hours after his return from the river. That's an extraordinary phenomenon for a poet, a man who deals in words, whose life had been words. And I was impressed and intrigued by that combination or elements in the poem sufficiently that I found time immediately, assuming that no one else would find this interesting, if Jonathan Bate had said that they weren't relevant, and I went to the British Library. First of all, I read the letters from Ted Hughes to Peter Keane, the photographer we have just seen there, with whom he worked on River. And what he did was show Peter Keane a map of where he fished. And that was published online in Granta, so it's still there. But I also then went from there to reading in a big leather-bound volume, a ledger, a Victorian ledger, the first of the fishing diary entries that I came across. And it happened to be from the months after he had submitted River to the publisher, and it was him going down to the river, Torridge, in North Devon, at 4:30 in the morning, leaving the house, to be there at dawn, to try to make contact with a big fish, a salmon or a sea trout, which had swum upriver the night before, and which he had managed to snag a scale of on the little treble hooks with which he doctored his lure. And I found this entry, and it was completely compelling. It was gripping. He hooked this fish at about 5:30 in the morning. He never saw it. The salmon lunged this way and that. Ted trying to work out what the salmon was thinking, what he was thinking, which way he would dart, how on earth Ted would manage to land this salmon, because the bank was complicated, full of debris. He played it. The salmon lunged this way and that. He played it. I was transcribing like mad on my laptop, there being no ink allowed, obviously, in the British Library's reading room. I turned the page. The salmon got off. I was gutted. But I sat back, and then I was horrified, because I had been transcribing. I was completely compelled by this. And I sat back, hands like that, and saw on my index finger a smudge of ink, a fingerprint of ink. And I turned back and found a smudge on the page where, entirely involuntarily, like the readers in the monastery in the name of the rose, I had been tricked into being stained, hooked. I faced a dilemma. Did I confess? And I'm confessing now in a rare book archive. And it's a kind of heresy. But having felt horrified, I then felt the last time this ink was wet was the evening on which Ted, after this entirely non-verbal experience, came back to his writing room, his shed, and committed this to the page. And I felt extraordinarily close to him. In the months that followed, I acted on that map. I happened to read River by the River Tamar, a river in Devon, and I acted on that map. I made a transcription of it. I went there. I discovered this beautiful valley with the river in the distance. I self-consciously read from my iPhone the transcript of that diary entry to where I thought Ted must have been fishing when he hooked and lost this fish. It felt extraordinary, but it felt a bit random until I read these words, and I hadn't really realized this before, that it was the most enthralling moment of all my fishing on the Torridge, to have imagined fishing that run as I was now doing, and as I've very rarely done for so many years, knowing that it is the ideal way to fish it. In Torridge Fishery, there's a photograph of somebody fishing exactly where I was when the fish took. And now to have that ideal image so marvelously realized, bang, there in the heavy current. And I went back to Cambridge, was the first person ever to take Torridge Fishery out of the Cambridge University Library. Saw that I had been in the right place, that there was Lemon Gray, the author of Torridge Fishery, standing in more or less the same place. Now, in the meantime, the bridge to allow fishermen, his guests, to cross the river had been swept away by the power of the river. But there I was. And I felt, if it's okay for Ted Hughes, great poet, to feel excited about fishing in someone's footsteps, and to have an ideal image so marvelously realized by that contact with a fish, what I needed to do was dispense with academic objectivity and give myself to this. And I did. And that's what I've been doing in The Catch. I've been fishing in his footsteps wherever he fished, not alas yet in Canada or Alaska, where he fished, because I haven't been able to afford the airfare before, but in Devon, in Scotland, in Ireland. And it has changed my life. It has woken me up to the accuracy of his observation of the life of the river and the life of the lakes he was fishing in. I've seen how in that book, Torridge Fishery, there are named pools. So I'm going to move over here. Stump Pool. A wonderful poem, Stump Pool in April, is set there. That is the landscape of his poems, and reading poems in place, river testing them, makes you see that this is a poet of extraordinary empirical precision. And this is the copy of the book that I've taken with me, not the glossy edition with photographs, but now battered spine, reflecting the additions that Ted Hughes made over 10 years, really to expand this and make it a book entirely for his son, Nick, to whom he dedicated it, and with whom Ted existed as a father to a son in a way that I think is just as important as his role as her husband. He said in the course of writing this book that it was a book not intended for readers. And it's really fascinating, this, I think. Everything had to be of first order intensity, and he had to make sure that there was the frustration that he began to feel with the photographs and the illustrated book was that he thought his poems may just become illustrations for a coffee table book for fisheries scientists or fisheries officers. This meant too much for him and for his son, and the experiences that they had together made him confess to Peter Keane that he was bedeviled by a need to supply evidence in writing of what I'm writing about, a concrete presentation of the setting and characters involved. And what I've discovered, this is not a poet who, as Jonathan Bate and others think, was so traumatized by the death of Sylvia Plath that he either wrote in mythic mode or in elegiac mode in the poems that he published at the end of his life, Birthday Letters. And they're powerful poems. These are poems about what I was doing yesterday on this pool with these friends. And he had different friends for different species of fish, which is a different world. And yes, Ted Hughes, fishing for Ted Hughes was half his life. It was, he told the daughter of someone I'm going to mention in a minute, his way of breathing. But in those years of fishing and writing and keeping fishing diaries for this book, River, he was also understandably haunted by earlier experiences, which he expanded the book to just nibble away at and which are reflected in my book. Back in Cambridge, we've already heard, and I wasn't going to mention this, that I shared a room with Ted Hughes 40 years afterwards. The burnt fox came into his room while he was asleep, having failed to write a line of an essay on Samuel Johnson, and came down 3 steps into the room, a burning fox man said, "Stop this, you are destroying us," and put a bleeding paw on the page. Ted Hughes took that so seriously that he switched from reading English to archaeology and anthropology. He regarded that as a sign that the way English was taught at Cambridge then was hostile to the life of the creaturely imagination. He changed, but throughout his time at Cambridge, and it was the 7-year pit in London, the 7 years in his life that he wasn't fishing, and he too had started fishing when he was 4, he wrote to his brother Gerald in February 1957, "Though I haven't been fishing for 7 years, I dream every single night that I am fishing, mostly at a pond called Crook Hill in South Yorkshire, where he spent his teenage years during the war." To his son, Nick, he wrote in February 1998, "When I was in good contact with myself, the pond would be full of big pike." And to Gerald, his brother, but not for, I think, understandable reasons, to Nick, he said, "One night I dreamed I caught the grandfather pike at Crook Hill, at the corner near the outflow. You and Johnny Woley, his teenage friend, were pulling at its fins, and I was heaving down the slope. We had 20 feet of this thing, and still most of it was in the pond. The next day, I sold my first poem and got married. Sylvia is my luck completely," which is not quite the same as saying my lucky charm. My luck completely. When he told this story to Tom Perot, a Canadian fishing journalist, in 1994, Tom Perot's response was, "And you mean you still married her? She was a pike that he couldn't land." Strange stuff. And it gets stranger. Sylvia took that dream, which he shared with her, and he took the burnt fox dream that I've just mentioned and turned them, shamelessly plagiarized, into a story about a young American couple. Harold has a vivid dream life. Agnes can't dream. The story ends very badly for Agnes. Read it. She published it in January 1957 in an issue of Granta magazine in Cambridge. 5 pages from a poem by David Weddell, a Canadian poet over in Cambridge at King's College, who was being visited. They were reading, but they were doing more than reading at the weekends, by Assia Lipsley, whom he'd met, and they started an affair. He'd met on the ferry over. When Ted and Sylvia came to the States in 1957, 1958, and Sylvia was teaching at Smith College, Ted wrote one of his masterpieces, Pike, and it's about recalling and reclaiming that experience, I think, of fishing at Crook Hill. It was as deep as England. It held pike too immense to stir, so immense and old that past nightfall I dared not cast, but silently cast and fished with the hair frozen on my head. Pike are menacing creatures. These are immense fish. For what might move, for what I might move. Remember that I. The still splashes on the dark pond, owls flushing the floating woods, frail on my ear against the dream. Darkness beneath night's darkness had freed. That rose slowly towards me, watching. That menacing eye, that menacing dream. Darkness beneath darkness, night's darkness had freed. There is a sense of real fear in what lies beneath, what's watching you when you fish. Here is Crook Hill Pond in 1952 with Ted and his brother Gerald. Here is Crook Hill Pond when I photographed it, and it's basically a sludgy pit in the middle of a golf course, and that's an abandoned golf trolley, and that's the outflow where, in the night before his marriage to Sylvia, he fished. Sylvia and Ted, when they moved to Devon, sublet their flat in London to David and Assia Weddell, who would have seen a broadside published in Northampton, Massachusetts by Leonard Baskin's Gehenna Press of pike. They invited their tenants down to Devon, and they came in mid-May 1962, just after Ted had written a fantastic poem called Stealing Trout on a May Morning. Assia is reported of saying, "I'm going to seduce Ted Hughes." Having read The Wishing Box, having seen pike, she knew just how. And she reported a dream, which Ted wrote about in birthday letters, After a single night under our roof, she told her dream. A giant fish, a pike, had a globed golden eye, and in that eye a throbbing fetus. You, Sylvia, were astonished, maybe envious. I refused to interpret. I saw the dreamer in her had fallen in love with me, and she did not know it. Well, that moment, the dreamer in me fell in love with her, and I knew it. Refused, past tense, to interpret. He must have realized, particularly editing Sylvia's short stories, Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams, in 1977. Way before then, Sylvia felt it too. As Assia and Ted began an adulterous affair, Sylvia went upstairs to his study in Court Green, started burning the letters she found there. The spry hooks that bend and cringe, which is a reference to Ted's letter formation. Cleansing this attic. At least I won't be strung just under the surface, dumb fish with one tin eye. She's saying she's not, but it's reflecting the notion of this fish eye lens, and it's not a golden eye. She's feeling desperate. All that underlays experiences which transformed and renovated and released Ted's experiences of fishing for pike with his son and with a man I met in May 2012, Barry Cook, British-born Irish artist, completely compulsive fisherman. And it turns out best friend too of Seamus Heaney, though I didn't know that then. Jonathan Bate had written to him, Barry never replied. When I said, I'm interested in talking to you about fishing with Nick and Ted, he said, come and stay. It was amazing. And he took me to Yeats's grave and poked a stick at Yeats's grave. He showed me this extraordinary relic of a homemade pike spoon, Nick's piking spoon, with a tin eye. And he also showed me artist proofs of the only poem Ted published in his handwriting as part of a limited edition of lithographs written with Barry Cook about their pike fishing. And it's called The Great Irish Pike. Sorry, screen sharing swallowed that bit. And here are these menacing, brilliant images of pike that Barry drew for it. We're very lucky. He showed me these images. I told Carol Hughes about this very generously. She donated this to the college. And I've had these on my room for the last 10 years. And so I get to know this poem extremely well. This seems cryptic, mythic. I'm just going to take one line. This is no place for anything fishy that revives the smile of the dragon. What the hell does that mean? The loch is not named. You never named a loch where you caught big fish, because otherwise people wouldn't, catch those fish, so you lied and lied. But at the bed and breakfast they stayed in, they often met a guy they called Jim the Terrorist, who was a seller of aerial photographs. When you look at an aerial photograph of Loch Gur, you have a smiling dragon smell. Here are Ted and Barry, taken by Barry's daughter, Anya, to whom Ted said, fishing is my way of breathing. Just notice they're in different boats. And that's important because of I said, there's only one place I'd rather be today. We are, I think, the 45th anniversary of the first of the fishing diaries that Ted ever wrote. And it was when, in the October half-term holiday of 1977, when Nick was 15, Barry, having tried for 6 years to lure them over by sending Nick homemade pike plugs with teeth marks in them, finally persuaded them to go over, found them a loch to fish in, and bingo, on the third day, Nick caught a 24.5-pound pike. Now, we don't know when, according to this caption in the selected letters of Ted Hughes. Castle Loch. You will not find Castle Loch on a map. October 1976. Wrong. It was 1977. That's a curious mistake to make, as is the date. In the last year of his life, just before he published Birthday Letters, Ted published this poem, Some Pike for Nicholas. And again, there's a lot more going on in here than I have time to say, but down the Black Drain and across the Black Loch, which I have fished, where whitecaps burned, you came tossing on a saucer out of childhood, pulled by lean black pike. What the hell does that mean? Well, That is the saucer. That's Barry Cook's homemade coracle, which I now have in my possession, amazingly. Again, Loch na Cashel's great queen. You never use the name of the lot. You won't find Loch na Cashel either. Granted you your prayer, which was to take her in your arms on your mother's birthday and give her the kiss of life in the Catstail Shallows. Now, just for a moment, you wonder, who is he giving the kiss of life to? Is it the female pike, the queen? Or could it be Sylvia? Could there be something revived there? But the Catstail Shallows, what the hell does that mean? Well, remember the aerial photographer. That is an aerial view of Castle Lake, County Clare. Turn it upside down, it's a cat. And these are the Catstail Shallows. I've been there, I fished. That is a pike, not 24.5 pounds that I caught there. And then I went back on the 27th of October, a beautiful place. The really blissful feeling of being on perfect waters from which everybody had been excluded, being in untouched waters, said Ted Hughes in that long diary entry. He's right, and that poem and that lake, unlike Crookhill Pond, is still pristine and marvellous. They moved on from Castle Lake to this Loch Gur, which is the site of the Great Irish Pike. There's much more to be said about this, but crucially, in Ted's fishing diaries, it's where Nick and Ted achieved happiness together. And happiness for a man as affected by loss as Ted Hughes was a rare commodity. Fishing the moon under the moon, Loch Gur and the moon smile at each other, two big grins, Nicky being happy. Capturing that happiness, capturing the dream, uncontaminated by everything that had happened to it. Ted writes, the pike's broad grin, roughed with Loch Gur's ice, stoniest, oldest eye of reality, welcomed your welcome, Nick, where Cranog's artificial islands pondered my boy, my dream alive without distraction. They went back to Loch Allen, where Nick hooked and lost a fish that would have qualified as great. Ted was sure, a 30-pounder. I went there in much more clement conditions. Barry, in these years, produced what's his masterpiece, a gilt and golden and green Loch Derg pike based on a fish caught at its life size in 1860, a 90-pound pike, with relics, again, historic fishing tackle. Friendship focused on pike developed between these three men: father, son, fish friend, artist, compulsive fisherman. One more bit of evidence of those fishing diaries' power. I met Barry first time in 2012. I went back a year later. By then, he had developed dementia. He was 82. He'd moved from independent living in County Sligo to a warden-controlled maisonette in County Kilkenny. I went back to restore to him a stuffed trout, which Olwyn, Ted's sister, had given me, as you do. And I turned up in the village to see Julia, his daughter, who told me, look, Dad may not remember having agreed to see you. And he's lost his short-term memory. He's also lost the letters that meant so much to him. And it turned out that these letters were letters from poets and artists galore, an extraordinary range of them. She rang, Dad, were you expecting Mark? Yes, I want to see him. So I went round the next morning. It was a kind of tiny place, very primitive, but I read to him a 200-line verse diary entry from February and March 1980, where Ted had flown over trying to catch a salmon, and eventually, after 5,000 casts over 3 days, had felt solid communication with the prize, contact. And this first diary entry ended, "It's the most beautiful salmon I've ever seen," said Barry. And Barry had been sitting there completely rapt. And he said, "I did say that, Mark." And it was. And then he said, "Would you like to see the letters?" And he turned behind him, pulled this little curtain, cubbyhole, came out with a leak packing box stuffed with extraordinary poems and letters from Seamus Heaney, Robert Lowell. Long story short, from moving beyond the archive, we've now been able to add to our own archive by Barry Cook's those letters. We were given a chance to bid for them. This is Barry's response to their pike fishing trips together. This is Nick, a man for casting full effort, wonderful vivid colour and images. Nick again. Nick's pike on Alan, that huge fish that leapt, and which is reflected in Some Pike for Nicholas. From his coracle there, he sees Nick and Ted Hughes bringing a pike into the net, emerging from the ripples of the water. The rod faintly visible, but it's connected. Amongst those letters, there are photographs. On New Year's Day 1985, here is Seamus Heaney, here is Barry Cook, Ted Hughes motorcycles in Dublin, Black Rock. And Barry had done an image miming and mimicking and having a laugh at the opening line of pike, bike, 3 inches long, perfect bike in all parts. So that this friendship survived. And it's represented vividly in a guest book of Barry's from the 23rd of August, 1990. Here and there, and in the archive, there are about 100 typescript and manuscript poems by Seamus Heaney. Here is an early version of one of his squarings about Barry's studio. The same day, and in fact, probably with him, Dennis O'Driscoll, his interviewer, close friend, and the photographer of that picture, and Julie O'Callaghan came with him. And then on the next page is a poem by Ted, which he'd originally sent him as a thank you present for that first trip in 1977, now wrote it out in 90, then came back with Nick. And he found perfect, complete happiness there, he told Seamus. And here is a pike swimming happily into the jaws of Morrigu, the Irish death goddess. And without Ger, God would have given up. Ger became this site of extraordinary, happy contact with these violent predators who somehow they wrought into their own mythology. So there is much more to be done on that. And I can say a little bit more about that. But from trying to escape the archive fishing in his footsteps, we're back with an enlarged archive with my next book, which I can say more about. But anyway, I hope that's okay.
So thank you. I'll come back up on the screen. Thank you so much, Mark. And we do have time. We have time for some questions. So if anyone in the room does have them, feel free to voice them. For those of you on Zoom, do put them in the chat and I'll read them on your behalf. If anyone wants to kick it off in the room, Maggie at the back, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was just a wonderful talk and a reminder that we often come to writers with misguided preconceptions be relevant for understanding their creativity. That bakes this assumption that fishing is just something peripheral to the poetic. And partly what you were talking reminded me at the end too with the title of the collection, River. Mm-hmm. I got interested. I was pretty interested because there is a whole literary as well as sort of fishing tradition of this of water poetry, going back to the classical world and a lot of the 17th century, Spencer, Drayton, Michael, John Denham, the lake poets. Alice Oswald is the most recent example of that. And so I was interested that he has the title River, which seems to put it very much in that tradition, like Derwent or Dart. But the focus is also on fishing. That changes it.
It really does. And of course, you know better than I do the richness of that literary tradition, Maggie. Oh, sorry, yeah. So Maggie has just asked the title of this collection, River, could be seen to speak to a rich tradition of river poetry. But actually, and in fact, my emphasis on the role of fishing in it, and I think it's a kind of discovery that that every poem does proceed from a particular fishing experience. Ted was aware of that tradition, of course, but he, I think, is much more interested in following the lives and identifying with the lives of the fish through the year. And not many of the poems are about catching fish, but they are about identifying imaginatively with them and inhabiting, losing words, going into the water with them and seeing the angler's figure as a kind of bulged, distorted, clumsy figure on the bank. I wanted to emphasize that because its early admiring reviewers, and there have been many people who love Ted Hughes's River, have never emphasized the role of fishing. And I think he got frustrated by that, to be honest. So he also worked with a guy called Ihor Boyanovsky towards an anthology of fishing writing. Never published it, but Ihor lives in Nighthawk Ranch in British Columbia, and they fished the Dean River for steelhead together. He also discussed the need with another poet that he met and a fisherman, Tom Rawling, for poems that spoke from within as fishermen. And Ted believed that fishermen had a biological dynamo in their heads and their hearts, which allowed them to respond to the life and care for the life of the river from inside, from wading deep, in a way actually that much of the tradition of river poetry that you've described doesn't. So I think he was aware of it, but he saw the importance of actually getting your feet not wet because he was wearing neoprene waders, but getting deep. Yeah. Sorry, is that?
Yeah, no, I can see that very much, that, the title seems to invoke that tradition.
Yeah,
he's shifting
he really is shifting it. He really is shifting. The other book that, in terms of that tradition, he was fully aware of was A River Runs Through It.
Yes.
And he rented, with a friend of his called Ian Cook, he privately rented a cinema in Exeter so they could have a private view of it. So he was aware of it, but I think he was absolutely he was keen to make sure these are poems which emerged from the diaries, his own experiences.
I'll read a question from the Zoom crowd. This comes in from Brian Traherne, who's joining us virtually. A fascinating and minor detail. I will quote Brian verbatim, so I'm not misrepresenting it. On the hand-drawn map that you showed earlier in the slides, we saw at the bottom the owner of Nethercott Fishing mentioned as Michael Morpurgo.
Yeah.
Such a rare surname. Can this really be the Michael Morpurgo?
It is absolutely Michael Morpurgo, author of Warhorse. And Ted introduced himself to Michael. He loomed out of the darkness, or the kind of dusk, in the summer of 1975, where he'd been fishing for sea trout on the River Torridge. Michael owned the fishing, and they founded a really strong friendship in which Ted was supporting Michael in his writing, consoling him when Warhorse did not win the Whitbread Prize as he was shortlisted. Michael, I've had one conversation with him. He does not fish. Ted fished passionately, and Michael, in an introduction to a recent edition of Salar the Salmon, not the autobiography, but by Henry Williamson, he talks about Ted and the Torridge as his river. Ted knew this river and its fish in a way that Michael, as someone who bought the fishing with the land that he bought, never could. But it is absolutely that. What's really striking is that now Iddesleigh and the beautiful valley in which it sits is known as Warhorse Valley. When I turned up looking for Ted Hughes's fishing, I was the first person ever to do that because they assumed I was a Morpurgo fan. And of course, I'm not a Morpurgo fan, but I have, it's a story and a passion which nobody had thought to kind of inherit or dig out. Yeah, unearth. So definitely Michael Morpurgo, it's that one, yeah.
It's well spotted as well. I think the annotation on the map, the well spotted.
Sorry, yeah,
reading the fine print. We have a couple of editions of River, including the one that has photographs, which if you're interested, you can flip through at the front here. But I found it, we were chatting about this just before the talk, and I wondered why you chose this edition in particular as opposed to the other ones, or obviously a little bit less portable. Not quite your Riverside reading, but perhaps you'd comment about the edition.
Sure, absolutely. Ted as I said, got very frustrated with this edition. And it's a beautiful book and beautifully produced book, but they needed to get the sponsorship of British Gas for this. And there is no correspondence between particular poems and the photographs that they face. And so I've now lost my glasses, but essentially there is a poem called 80 and Still Fishing for Salmon, which the fishing diaries prove emerged from a few days with an elderly fisherman on the Cork Blackwater in Ireland. It faces here a picture of the Scottish River Dee, known as a river that flows out of paradise, says the caption. Then it says, near here, at this point, a British gas pipeline goes unseen and unheard under the river. And Ted hated that. He thought that his poems were just going to be captions for a fisheries officer's coffee table book. And so there were 3 collaborations that he did: Cave Birds, Remains of Elmet, and River. And in 1993, he published them all as 3 books. And he added a lot of poems, he changed them, he made it only for Nick. And I think it became much purer, not just to those experiences, but to a greater span of experiences. So he included this amazing poem, Stealing Trout on a May Morning, which he wrote just before Assia and David Webble came to stay. The reason I got into that, there is an image in that poem about wading upstream, a young, vigorous, fit male wading up a stream which flowed much faster than it does now because of over-abstraction and drainage. And he looks down as he's wading upstream and he sees a drowned woman hugging each ankle. And he could not have written that the following spring, by which point Sylvie had taken her own life. So I kind of worked out from letters, both edited in Christopher Reed's edition and the originals in the Lilly Library edition in University of Indiana, exactly when he must have written that poem and the techniques he must have used. And it's using a Devon minnow, which Michael has just shown you some selections of. But it was that made me think, I didn't want to let Ted Hughes off the hook, for infidelity, but nor did I want to make him solely responsible for this. And when I started, for what happened, and when I started looking, I thought there is a really fascinating, hitherto untold story about his credulous belief in dreams and what sharing them led to. And I'm pretty sure that sequence of events and dreams that I put together did contribute. And I think that makes the rediscovery and reconnection with his son, whom he'd introduced to fishing in July 1966, when they were in Ireland together, to stir the dormant passion for the art, as he said. He's both his children, but Nick really loved it. Frida thinks it's a bit cruel. I wanted to make sure that I gave weight to the rediscovery of a fish that he had moved beyond, and he really did. He identified with the predator, the great Irish pike, the solitary pike in his cell. The pike has been condemned for his violence. Ted believed in natural violence. Ted believed in the primacy of the predatory instinct, but he also came to protect those fish and the waters in which they swam. And he became, from being a great killer of fish, a great protector of fish, and the founder of the West Country Rivers Trust, a great environmentalist. And that change and development in attitude is something that I tell the story of in the book too. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I get carried away.
Long and very welcome. I think we're coming up on the hour here, so thank you all for attending, and thank you for such an enlightening talk. I grew up fishing on the rivers of southern Alberta and British Columbia myself, and it's really powerful to reconnect with words and the concept of fishing and see the power of it in this particular poet's life. So thank you, Mark, for sharing not only your work and your insight into this person, but also your process of inhabiting an archive, of moving beyond it, and of adding to it in the end. And as we saw today, Michael Harris actually brought some more things that won't end up in the Pembroke College archives, but the archive exists everywhere and things are added to it all the time. So an enormous thank you from us, and thank you from everyone who attended. And we'll give.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining online too. Great.